agenda?
So tonight we're going to talk about Common Core state standards for mathematical practice. We'll take a little bit of time to first dig into the standards themselves and try to ground ourselves in a deep understanding of at least one of them, if not several. And then we're going to take a look at two activities focusing around Algebra 1 and around statistics to kind of see how the TI Math Inspired activities and the Math Nspire software can help us really allow students to become proficient in their standards for mathematical practice.
Thanks, Katie. And Jeff is going to discuss our expected outcomes.
So we certainly want to learn. We have some learning outcomes here. We want to learn more about the Common Core math practices, how they apply to us, how we can implement them in our classroom, how we can use maybe some Math-inspired pre-made activities in a way that would be engaging and interesting, also just, again, to reinforce those standards, those mathematical practices. Specifically today, we're going to look at an Algebra 1 activity and a statistics activity, which I think even if you don't teach statistics, I think you'll see it applies to many different levels as stats has creeped into our curriculum. And we also want you to stay in touch with social media and upcoming events.
Thanks, Jeff. Katie, go ahead and share your desktop. And you'll notice as Katie is doing this, that right section of your screen where the chat and the Q&A windows were located, they're now underneath that green floating toolbar. So if you want to, again, ask a question or even maybe respond to some questions I think maybe Katie and Jeff are going to be asking during the webinar, you can respond to questions in the chat window. And if you actually have questions that you want to try and have answered live, the Q&A window is really the best place for that. Katie, it's all yours. Katie, I think you might be muted. Can you double check that and unmute yourself? There you go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Is that better?
That is better.
Much better.
So I wanted to start tonight by grounding us in the standards for mathematical practice themselves. And what you're looking at in front of you is a document that's simply containing the original source document from the Common Core State Standards of all 8 standards for mathematical practice. So just as a reminder, we have making sense of problems and persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others, modeling with mathematics, using appropriate tools strategically, attending to precision, looking for and making use of structure, and looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. As I scrolled through those, you notice that each one of those is not just the title in and of itself. There's a lot of really rich language that comes with those. And so what I'd like us to do is to start by actually digging into, let's just take time to do one. And so we're just looking at the very first standard for mathematical practice, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. I'd like you to take a minute and read through that, and in the next 60 seconds, identify keywords or phrases that really speak to you from this paragraph. If you could type those into the chat window, Jeff and Mike are going to be taking a look at those and letting us know what are some of the phrases that you really think are important in that paragraph.
By the way, happy birthday to Vincent, who's celebrating his birthday as an attendee on the webinar.
We getting anything in that chat window?
Not yet. How often do you, I mean, because I think I've read through the whole things maybe once, but I don't know that I usually see a bulleted approach here, and this is the full kind of version there of the math practices of this one. How often have you taken a pretty deep look at these? I know you're kind of a Common Core expert.
So I do look at these on a regular basis, and I actually sometimes force myself to come back and look at these because it is our tendency to break them into a bulleted list so that we can use them more easily in planning, or so that we can use them with our students or when we're doing walkthroughs or planning. But sometimes when we do that, we tend to lose a lot of the richness of what the standards are actually asking for us to look at for our students.
Yeah. Tammy Jones mentioned perseverance, persevere in problem solving. Barry said monitor and evaluate progress and change the course when necessary. Boy, that's the sign of a great teacher, isn't it? When you can change course because of something you're responding to student learning. It's all about the students here. When you start reading this, Sandra says, consider analogous problems. Kathy says, I think explain is the most significant work in this practice. Persevere is next. So explain.
And explaining,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, students need to explain. Sometimes they think just the answer is enough. Well, I got the right answer. Can you explain yourself? Can you back that up?
And so things like trying special cases and simpler forms and considering those analogous problems so that students are really sort of testing the waters and how do I approach this problem, and maybe even, like we said, changing those courses, how do we start a problem and then maybe realize, hey, this isn't the most efficient way to do this, and changing the course in between. So all of these things are really important, and it's important to remember that these standards for mathematical practice, every single one of them starts with mathematically proficient students.
Yeah.
So we have to remember that our students are going to be assessed on this, but beyond assessment for this is what we want for our students when they go out into the world, is we want them to be proficient in these standards. And so we want our students to be the ones that can look at something and change course as you move forward.
Yeah, and one more comment. Kathy says, and this requires a whole different approach to homework assignments and assessments as well. It changes a lot of the way we run our class. So let's dive in. Let's see kind of what activity you have for us and how that could be maybe different than maybe what we're doing in our classroom right now.
Thanks so much for that segue. So TI has wonderfully created pre-made activities for you, so you don't have to come up with these types of activities that really engage your students on your own. So the activity that I'm working with tonight for just a short period of time here is from the Math Nspired website. It's an Algebra 1 activity, and it's specific to linear equations. And so if you I've taken the liberty of capturing the context of the question and put it right here on our screen. And we've got Jennifer and Steve that are planning a high school reunion because they want to be able to give money back to buy computers for their school. And they're going to be given several situations in which they need to determine which one of these halls is going to be the best rental place to hold their reunion. So on the next page, I'm capturing the 3 scenarios that are given to you. And so we have the Galaxy Inn, in which they have a rate of $17 per person with a minimum charge of $400. In the middle towards the bottom, we have the Holiday Lodge that charges $500 for the first 25 guests and then $12 per person in excess of those 25. And we have the Pines Country Club that charges a flat fee of $90 and then $14 per guest. So this gives us an opportunity to ask a launching question of our students. So I'm going to ask you to concentrate here just a minute at just the Galaxy Inn. And as a participant, I want you to think about how many guests are needed to exceed the minimum charge at the Galaxy Inn. So the minimum charge is $400. How many guests is it going to take to be able to get to that or exceed that $400? And think about what tools would you use to attack that problem?
What tools in my classroom? So what tools would we use?
So we're thinking about tools such as to solve the problem, for you solving the problem. If I want to figure out how many people is it going to take to meet that minimum charge of $400, am I going to write an equation? Am I going to graph? Am I going to use tables? Am I going to look at this numerically and just sort of plug and chug and work my way through? I would venture to say that many of us are probably going to set up and solve an equation. And this actually brings us to the question of what other tools could you use? Tools in our classroom are things like paper and pencil, things like rulers, calculators, but I would argue that our tools are also, are we going to use a table to look at this, or are we going to use a graph and our multiple representations there? Let me ask our participants out there, what might be some other tools besides the calculator, besides paper and pencil? What other kinds of tools do you use in your classroom?
And Katie, if I could just jump in quickly.
Sure.
It looks like that we're getting a lot of really great responses in both the chat and the Q&A window. And it's really helpful if Jeff and Katie can see those responses. And the fastest way for them to see them is in the chat window. So if you have a specific question, like I have a couple people that have some questions, feel free to ask those in the Q&A window is the best place for the questions. But if you have a response to one of Katie or Jeff's questions, can we try and put that in the chat window? And then the second thing I want to mention is that a lot of people are using the chat window, but they are chatting to me directly as the host. And if you're doing that, that's sending me a private message, which means, unfortunately, Katie and Jeff are not seeing it. So just to sort of make things really clear, if you have a question about anything during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A window. If you have a response to a question, please use the chat window, and you'll see there's a drop-down on the chat window. It says Send To, and there's lots of choices. The best choice so that everyone can see your response, including Katie and Jeff and myself, is send it to all participants. So again, if you choose all participants in that chat window, it'll go to everyone.
And here's an oldie but goodie, small whiteboards and markers. Sometimes each student can even have those, and it's one of Kathy and Matt's favorite tools. They use that. TI-73 for Michael here, large graph paper. Large graph paper, I'm guessing that's the kind like you post on the, up there on your whiteboard, and or even sometimes I have a drop-down graph paper, and if you ever use that, it's kind of old school. Navigator, of course, is a tool. Students are tools. Interesting.
Absolutely. What a great response. Students as tools.
Yeah.
So you'll notice.
What do you have for us here? What is this?
So I was going to say, you notice that I actually pulled up my TI-Nspire software, and when you look at, just give me a second here, I'm going to flap back over. I mentioned the fact that I pulled this actually from the TI website, the Math Nspired website, and with every activity comes a set of student and teacher directions. And so right now I'm just popping up here for you the teacher notes, and you'll notice that in the teacher notes they give us a lesson context, they tell us how to launch the lesson and possible closures. And as I scroll through even further, we've got more student questions, and they even provide answers and even possible assessment questions for you. But I wanted you to see that they've actually in this particular lesson, they're asking us to provide the students with these functions so that we can examine the 3 different situations a bit more closely. I would say that if we wanted to look at the standard for mathematical practice of that we just talked about and asking our students to persevere a bit more, you might even want to consider scaffolding, removing some of that scaffolding for your students and not give them those functions, and ask them how they would tackle that problem and see and try to guide them towards proficiency and being able to persevere, and how would they plan a solution path. But having
would you have them in groups for this, do you think? I mean, does groups work better for this kind of a thing with these Math Nspired?
My students are always in groups. I absolutely believe that students, if you want to bring up, again, another standard for mathematical practice, if you want your students engaging in rich discourse and having them constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others and really learning how to persevere from each other, working in groups is the best way to go about that. So coming back to the Nspire software, the teacher directions tell us how to go ahead and define each one of these functions in our software. And you'll notice from what the page that I showed you before, that f of n here is our galaxy n. That was our first situation. We also have Noble Pines, which is here as g of n, and the Holiday Lodge we have here as h of n. And notice that we entered each one of these as a linear equation. And most of us, and myself included, really I like to look at this graphically. But one of the nice things about this particular lesson that's made for us is that it encourages the youth to look at things in tables, which is something, that is, I feel, often underutilized, and pretty powerful in terms of a tool in mathematics.
Can I tell you, this what happened to me? I tutor a lot of students for ACT, and I ask them how did they solve that problem. And every once in a while I'm surprised. And the last student I tutored, he actually started showing me how he used the table to solve a problem. And it's just so rare because I don't think they ever think to use the table. Most students are not going towards this at all. It's not in their thought process. And I had one student who actually was.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that students don't like to go to tables very often?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing that maybe teachers aren't using tables as much. I'm curious to the attendees, are you using tables? And if so, in what class are you using tables? Do you use tables much? And how do you use them? I'm curious. And Julie asked, I wish she was better at tables. The shortcut on TI-Nspire, if you want to know the shortcut, is hit Control-T to get a table and then Control-T to get rid of a table. It's kind of a neat thing when you're on a graph to do that, or a list and spreadsheet page. It'll also work there as well. Tables when running regressions. Intercepts, you look at the tables. Finding irrational roots from the tables. Use them in algebra and geometry, especially if they have to predict something. It's interesting. So I'm seeing a lot of teachers are maybe using the tables maybe more than I thought here. I was just guessing. Sometimes we don't know what other teachers are doing in their classrooms.
You're absolutely right. I think one of the reasons why students don't go to tables automatically is sometimes, depending on the context, it's really difficult to hone in on that specific value, that exact value, because you might have to be going in between your whole numbers, which are what students like to look for. And so this is another way to really encourage students to understand, you know, if I have to reset my table and look at what's happening when n equals 0.5, that I can do that, and students really learn and get a hold of those rational numbers and make sense of them a little bit more deeply.
You know, Myra has a good point here. She says that this table that we have could be confusing, especially for like 17N, because it's really supposed to be a price of 400 until that price of 400 is exceeded.
Exactly.
What do you think about that? I mean, that could be confusing, because right now the table, really, if it's 15 here for N, you know, it should be 400 right there. What do you think about that?
So I think it's good to expose your students to that to begin with, because then it comes back to making sense of the problem. And part of making sense of that problem is for them to understand that restriction on what's happening with this function, that until my domain is equal to a certain number of people, or until my range value is a certain number, I'm going to have the same number as it comes out. So when we use this as linear equations, as we're looking at right here, it is going to bring out confusion, but I think that sometimes confusion in students is good, provided that we're doing it in a good way, and we're asking those questions and making sure that we're probing into their understanding. So you're absolutely right. As I look at each one of these individual values, I'm really focusing in on what happens with each domain value and how that corresponds to a range value, and honing in on the fact that everything that's happening there, if I were to look at this graphically, I would not be able to see specifically as easily what's happening when my n value is 17 and looking at 289, 328, or 404, and be able to make a quick and easy determination as to which one of those is going to be my best value.
But boy, I'd love to see 400 in the table, wouldn't you, though? I mean, to see that.
So
wouldn't that be
my
nice?
original question, yeah. So my original question was, when does that happen? So it doesn't happen until we're up at 24 people. But Jeff, as you told me, the really elegant way to look at this problem, and to a great place to bring in enrichment, is if we start looking at this as piecewise functions. And we get our students to understand, you know, when we have those restrictions on domains, what happens. And the use of tables here really does help students understand even more numerically what's happening for every value right on up to that 24, what exactly is happening with my value, that no matter what my input is, no matter what my domain value is, I'm still getting 400 as an output as my range value, or I'm still getting 500 as my output or range value until I come all the way up here till 26 people. That's when things start to vary for all three of these functions.
Can you go back to that piecewise function page? Maybe for someone who hasn't used that tool, can you just show us how to use the tool, the piecewise function tool, if they haven't seen that?
Absolutely.
It is kind of neat, a use of this.
So you'll notice that I'm just typing in define, because what I'm doing here on the calculator page is I'm just defining what a function is. So I'm going to make up a new one, and I'm going to call it R of n. And I always like
is it right
using,
there next
if
to
I
9?
hit control, right there next to 9, I hit control. If you look at your little blue buttons right up there above. Oh, nope, I'm using the wrong one. You don't need to.
You don't need that. Yeah.
You don't need to hit control.
You could either say R of n colon equals, or you say define R of n. So there's two options there.
And so what I did was I hit the button right there next to 9. And you have different options here for piecewise. If I only had two functions that I was looking at, I could use this one. If I had more than that, I could choose this one. So if I wanted to do 3 functions or 4 functions, I could change that value here. I really like talking about when it's constant. So I like putting in the value for it too. And then you're going to put in you simply type in your domain value. So when n is less than, let's say, -1.
Let's say less than there. Yeah, there
Thank
you go.
you. I'm so glad somebody else is watching with what I'm doing on the computer.
Or that, there you go. Is X going to work there? It might. Or would have to use N.
You're right.
I don't know. I'm thinking N maybe.
Yeah, since we have our
yeah.
We're defining our domain.
You know, what happens if you leave it blank? Do you know what happens? No, the last one there. That would be like else. Like no, the second part of the last one. If you put the n squared in there and then just leave the last part blank, it's going to do in every other case. It's going to do n squared. If that makes sense, it's going to do n if you change that back to n. Yeah, it's just an else. It puts an else automatically back in there. I just wanted people to see how it's really a pretty easy tool to use there as far as the piecewise function. Are these functions in a different order than the screen was? That was one of our questions. I think f of n and g of n and h of n. Was g of n was that the function you asked us to think about?
Yes, g of n is the function that I asked you to think about, and on this screen, yes.
I mean, which one was? I guess.
So we're looking at this. The one I asked you to think about was this one here, and yes, it did switch columns in the table.
Yeah.
And so this is one we were looking at that should have been 400 all the way up.
Yeah.
And so the answer to my original question is obviously here are 24 people, but there are lots of other questions that you could ask your students to come back and look at this, to consider this problem. So I could ask them, what's the cost of 20 guests at all 3 of these lodges, or when is it less expensive to be at the Galaxy Inn versus the Holiday Lodge? And so we're getting at here yet another standard for mathematical practice. But I think I'm going to ask the audience, since it's been a while since they've participated, I'm going to ask them, which standards for mathematical practice do you see potential for coming out in this particular examination of linear equations or piecewise equations using tables?
And Katie, while we have a few people hopefully responding to that, Dennis had a good question that maybe you could respond to right now. And the question is, how did you get the full screen table with no function of x defined?
Okay. So if you could add a new list and spreadsheet page, Katie. Just go home. Yeah, sure. List and spreadsheet. There you go. Try hitting Control-T. Control-T. Does that give you a table, and you get to choose which function you want to put in there? And we could have called these names different. We could have called one function called Galaxy. That, in fact, looking back on it, One of the nice things about Nspire is you can actually call functions by a name, not just a letter. So it could be galaxy function, galaxy event, or something if we wanted to, or to help us distinguish which one is which, because it does get a little confusing with the F, G, and H. You're kind of like, okay, which one is which choice here? And so we could have called them by a different name if we wanted to, but you basically then just choose from the drop-down if you want to add more pieces to that. You just choose them, and they'll just add in there, and you can display 3 or 4 tables at once. And you can change the order as you need to.
Good, thank you. So what kinds of,
Oh, we have someone who says a number of things. I definitely see students constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. Now, some people are so familiar with these that they're using numbers. 2, 3, and 4 were all mentioned here. That's pretty good when you're so familiar you can just use the numbers with them. I'm impressed with that.
They're better than I am, and I use these every single day. I do like that we're talking about 2, though, because number 2 is modeling with mathematics. And that's essentially what we're doing with this problem, in that we're looking at being able to use functions to model the situation that's going on and connect diagrams and tables and graphs and the symbolic representation. But then we're also asking them to analyze those relationships. And I think most importantly is checking to make sure that their results make sense in the context of the problem.
Yeah.
So that goes back to that original question of when we were looking at our TI-Nspire on that first, when we were just using the graphs, does it make sense to have 21 people and only be $357 if the context of the problem says that we are looking at $400 up to as a minimum charge?
If you go back to page 2.2, the table, this is something I never thought about until I saw you, because I've done piecewise tables, and I've always taught it with graphs. And looking at this, it makes me think, well, man, maybe I should be showing them the table when I do piecewise function. It kind of helps it kind of make more sense that it's constant, and then you see it increasing after a certain point in time. When the domain changes there, it's really kind of powerful. It might help our students understand domain and range, like you've been talking about, and some of these concepts at a little deeper level.
Absolutely, and I think most importantly is that we're making those connections between the graphical representation and the numeric representation here with the table, and then back to the symbolic, and how all of those connect together so that students can really form that deep understanding of what these functions are actually doing. I think, though, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff, so that we can take a look at maybe another application besides just the Algebra 1.
Sure.
And while we're doing that, while Jeff's taking over, I just wanted to mention to everybody out there that while we're talking to you about so many different ways that just one activity can use the standards for mathematical practice, it's important to note that if we're really going to build proficiency in our students, that we want to make sure that we are focusing on maybe just one in a lesson, and being explicit with our students about we're going to work today on persevering, on making sense of this problem and persevering through it, and really paying attention to and purposely planning for how do we build this one standard for mathematical practice in this lesson today, rather than trying to just sort of checklist off it, oh, I hit all 5 of these standards for mathematical practice today. It's important for our students to know and understand what it is that we're aiming for, and that it really help them achieve each and every one of these as a singular standard. So
are you like my principal and you say you need to write your objective on the board every day? Maybe we need to write our standard on the board every day or something?
You know, if your principal is really looking for, if that's the most important thing to your principal and they want it written on the board, then I would contend that, yes, you want to identify which one standard for mathematical practice are we really working on today.
That's right. That's right. That wouldn't be bad. Okay, so this activity I got from Math Nspired, and it's the Statistics Inspired. And this year I'm actually teaching AP Stat for the first time in my classroom, but I think you'll find this activity has a lot of stuff for not just AP statistics, but also statistics has really kind of creeped into a lot of different subjects on many different levels, and it's certainly part of the Common Core. Here is the kind of what happens in this activity. And so we've got this data that represents the height of 15 hypothetical statistics students. And so what I really like the multiple representations we have here. If you just kind of hover your cursor over here, you can see the minimum of the box plot, the 5-number summary, Q1, median, Q3, and then that's not really the max there, but there's an outlier right here at 75. And I love the fact that you can kind of look down here and you can see the data pieces that make up this box plot, because with a box plot, you really can't see the individual data pieces, and here you can. And then it has some extra information, which is quite fascinating. This is the what we call X bar, which in AP Stat is another, and also what the calculator calls the mean of the data. And then if you add or subtract a standard deviation, SX is what the calculator refers to as the sample standard deviation. And so if I add standard deviation to the mean in one direction, that's what called one standard deviation away from the mean. In both directions, I've got those values. It tells me the exact values. I can look at those. I can compare them. I can grab things here and move it. In fact, I made the mistake, just to be honest with you, I made the mistake of starting to do box and whiskers plots without showing them first. And I was trying to show them why there's an outlier and a box and whisker, and they got so confused, and I thought, why didn't I show them this data first? Why didn't I show them how when this point is far away, you know, it's connected here, and then it becomes an outlier here, and so they could see how a box and whiskers worked. And then you just click this button, and I'll go back to the beginning here. And that the document, there's a document that goes with this. It's actually 4 pages. This is the student document, and they can fill this out. And I think you're right, Katie. I think working in groups with this kind of inquiry learning is a powerful way for students to learn and kind of be exposed to some new ideas that are in this document. And so the document really starts with some of these questions here. It shows heights of the students. In the table below, fill in the row. So you're supposed to kind of draw a little sketch of your data like we just saw. And so the students are supposed to sketch that out with the mean and the standard deviations. They're supposed to find out what the mean is, find out the median, and then figure out the standard deviation by subtracting this value from this one, and you get the standard deviation. And then the IQR is really, if you look back at this, the IQR is kind of the dimensions of the box plot. It's Q3 minus Q1 there. And so that's the IQR. And so if they've had a little bit of stats, they've maybe done that, maybe they've learned a little bit about that. And when I saw this, I thought, well, what's really happening here? I think they're using appropriate tools strategically. And this calculator, I mean, you think about the built-in, you know, we're able to see multiple representations here. We're able to really interact with the data. It's just so powerful. I thought it was more powerful than me drawing a box plot on the board where the students got confused as I was going through the steps of how to draw a box plot. I thought, well, they really need to see this, see how it's made with the data and see how it changes with the data. And it helps them explore and deepen their understanding of what's happening there. And so then I love the dynamic nature of Nspire. So if you go to here, it's skewed left, and so what you can do with the data, Katie, did you know you can grab more than one point at a time here?
I did not know that. See, I learned something new today.
It's a neat trick. So if you just click on all these points, I can actually take a whole mound like this and just move it all the way over. I actually tell my students that, and they think it's kind of neat. So now I've made this data skewed left. The tail is on the left here, and you can see that a little easier, I think, with the box plot, how this is a little longer whisker here. It even has some outliers out there. It's interesting that that one's not an outlier and those two are. So you have them change the data, and then they draw that here. they say, well, what's the mean, what's the median, standard deviation, IQR? And so they're seeing these things change. They're analyzing this and exploring things. And so the document goes on to ask some really good questions here. And I think the questions are probably my favorite part about the Math Nspired documents. In fact, one of the questions from the students one of the attendees here at this particular thing said, how do you, are the questions in Math Nspired actually aligned to Common Core? And I wasn't sure how to answer that. I know they have an inquiry basis, like it's inquiry mindset. I know that we have made connections with the Common Core, and I think sometimes, not all the time, sometimes the questions come from trying to answer and get into those Common Core questions. So I think sometimes they are actually aligned exactly to the Common Core, but I think the general philosophy is definitely aligned to the Common Core. What do you think about that? Are the questions specifically aligned to the Common Core?
I think it depends on when the lesson was developed. I think that there are some of the more recent lessons, they do specifically say this is the Common Core state standard that we're aligning to, and that's what this activity is aiming towards, including those standards for mathematical practice. But I think you're absolutely right, Jeff. Even the ones that are before Common Core came out, they are all built around this philosophy of standards for mathematical practice, even before that was the name we were calling it.
Yeah. And so I thought when I looked at these two questions, I thought maybe this standard was part of it. Reason abstractly and quantitatively, that we are attending to the meaning of mean and median. And I think those two words, certainly in Algebra 2, and how low does, are you familiar with the math standards? When do mean and median come into the standards? What grade level do you think?
It's interesting that you asked that, because I was just getting ready to ask you whether you'd ever used this lesson with students earlier than AP statistics, because mean and median come in, and we're talking middle school in Common Core state standards.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, so do your measures of variability like interquartile range and range, and students have to be fluent in that. So
like even
while you're
6th grade?
Yeah, even 6th grade. I think 7th grade it's where it really starts to hit hard. I would say that Debbie says 6th grade. Yep.
Yep. And so they're reasoning with those quantities. They're looking at the relationship between mean and median. I love that this document really gets to the heart of that relationship between the two. And I think when you attend to the precision here, communicating precisely, I found that in stats class, it's like a new language these students are learning. They're talking about skew. They're talking about mean and median. It's pulled with a skew. Is it symmetric? Is it bimodal? Is it unimodal? Some of these terms here, you really have to communicate. It's not natural for them to start talking about this. And so if they can get in a group and start talking and try to describe what they're thinking, because sometimes they can think it, but they have trouble saying it out loud. I think what another attendee was saying, to explain yourself, and that's an important aspect of this whole thing, is can you explain yourself mathematically?
And that the need for precision and vocabulary, again, goes all the way back to the 6th grade with those measures of variability and being fluent in using that language clearly and appropriately.
Yeah. So after they've described the shape, they're supposed to move on to page 1.4. So if you look at page 1.4, it's very similar to 1.3, but I think the emphasis is just a little bit different. Instead of seeing maybe how much data was within one standard deviation of the mean, they're trying to relate it to the box plot here. You can see the mean is interesting there. It's there, the one standard deviation away. It's interesting to me that the length of the IQR distance, the standard deviation is just a little bit bigger than IQR, it looks like. That 50% of the data in the middle half there, Q3 minus Q1. But this is just, again, a powerful way for them to see the connections and just see it on the screen there. And so it goes through some more questions. I think it's at page 1.4. On this page, shows the height used to reset the dot plot and fill in the rows in the table. And so I think on this one, we're really constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. We're breaking down the data into cases, and that's what I liked about this. Again, we're drawing the shape here, what symmetric, unimodal, what's the mean, what's the median, which one is bigger? Are they the same? Are they equal? So we're testing the relationship between mean and median. So we're really exploring that relationship on a deeper level. And then which measures of center seem to provide a more accurate description of the data. And so they have to know what measures of center are, right, mean and median. Which measures of spread? Well, now you're talking about standard deviation and IQR. And again, you may have to go around to, Katie, do you ever find yourself, when they're in groups, which groups do you go to usually more often, the low-performing groups or the high-performing groups? What do you do when they're in groups sometimes?
So it depends on the purpose of the lesson.
Yeah.
I got to be honest, I feel like I need to divide my time evenly amongst them because they all have different needs. And if I'm not specifically planning to spend time with one group of students to develop their understanding in something, I go to both the high students, the middle students, and the low students the same because they need that probing and they need that attention.
Yeah, yeah. And then I really like this page. It might be my favorite page in the document. When my students saw this, I was like, oh, this is great. So page 2.2, it just got this data here, and I like the fact that it's got these four values, which are measures of spread and measures of center. And what I like is when I grab a point here, I'm just going to grab one of these, and you pull it, and you can see visually what's changing here. Surprisingly, maybe to the students, the median and IQR aren't changing at all. And the mean and standard deviation are changing quite a bit when I have an outlier. And that's a concept that I just feel like sometimes they're memorizing that kind of a thing. Oh, when you have an outlier, it pulls the mean with you because this is really the mean here, and the standard deviation gets bigger. But now, I mean, they're just seeing it. They're seeing the numbers change here. And the questions kind of back up what you want them to see. And so they're asking you to describe the shape before you move, after you move that. They're asking you to explain, well, what happened to the mean and standard deviation. They're grouping them, interestingly, median and IQR. I want them students to think those two go together. I want them to think these two go together. So I think it was, do you think it was on purpose they asked the question in that way, that they were, I think it may be. What do you think, Katie?
I think that it's absolutely helping students build those connections, that when they can compare and group those things together, this was very clearly planned so that students could easily make those connections and to guide them towards that.
And again, they're making conjectures here. They're making, they're figuring out an argument, and they're critiquing the reasoning of others without being, offensive and this kind of a thing. I think there's a lot of learning going on in this document. I have another. Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's also very interesting to look at what you just said there about constructing viable arguments and how they have to learn to do that well. And really the only way you do that well is to connect to one of the other standards for mathematical practice that we were just talking about in terms of the need to be precise and attention to precision and using appropriate and correct vocabulary.
Yeah. I think communicating with others, again, this is not natural for them to do on this kind of a thing, and so they really have to reason this out and think it through. And they ask questions like this: would your answer change to be if you moved a different point? So what if I had moved a different point? Well, I love the fact that you can reset it and choose a different point and grab and see, oh, I don't know if you saw that, but the IQR, they started to change there. The IQR changed from 12 to 10 if I moved that point that was on the left and moved it here. So I wonder why that was. You can make conjectures about what might happen if you choose a different point and move a different point there.
And getting your students to ask that I wonder question is really important in promoting the standard for mathematical practice. And this TI-Nspire software really allows students to, as you just showed us, explore in that I wonder situation, what if situation.
Yeah. And I don't even know if I should show the screen after what you said earlier, Katie, because it really hit home with me when you said we really probably shouldn't try to teach all 8 standards in one activity. Although some of that overlap's going to happen, don't you think?
It's absolutely going to happen. It's going to be only natural that there's going to be more than one standard for mathematical practice in one activity. And I like that you have this here because it really shows how even just one activity can hit on. We have so many different options as teachers to choose which one of those standards for mathematical practice do we want to really focus on today so that we can be purposeful about what it is that we want our students to walk away with.
Yeah. And I like that. It seems like you want our students to be able to actually verbalize that they need to know and be able to say, well, we're making sense of problems or we're modeling with mathematics. Like for them to actually be able to talk about the standards. I think they're written in such a way that practices, at least, maybe are written in such a way that students can actually handle that concept and say, oh yeah, I can see that. We're making sense of problems. We're persevering in them.
The students absolutely can handle that, and they need to. If we want our students to be successful, they've got to know what they're aiming at, and we've got to be clear about what it is that we expect of them. And there's research that shows that if you communicate that to them clearly, that it makes them feel better, and they're more likely to be successful in getting where it is that we want them to get.
Yeah. And Vincent says, making a conjecture from a visual is really important and powerful there, which is true. I mean, I can't. Again, sometimes I feel like, we're up there and we're trying to show them, stuff, and students end up memorizing whatever we say in their notes, and we need to, show them visually, show that if we can represent it with this great representation, I think it's really powerful for them to see that they can interact. I love the fact that they can do this on their handheld in their group, that it's not just me showing them, that they're kind of moving it and seeing it for themselves. Because I think you can't underestimate that. I think Vincent is right about that. And it gives them their feeling of accomplishment, is what Nikita said here. Michael says he tends to visit groups that are lacking definition and ability in math terms, tend to proceed, know that these definitions tend to proceed much better. There are some groups that require more help than others. One of the comments I've gotten, I tend to ask for feedback after a chapter is over. And when I do one of these activities where, we're working in groups and we're doing those kinds of things, sometimes, and this is really teacher cockiness that comes out of me, I think, oh, well, they're missing out on my teaching. I mean, here, I'm not in front of the group teaching them. And actually, the students' response is the opposite of that. Sometimes they say, I felt like we got more individual attention from you today than we did from, when you're up there teaching in front of the class, which I thought was a really interesting comment. Their perspective is totally different from our perspective. And I think this Common Core, don't you think it helps us to think about what are they learning? It's really all about student learning. And
it really is, especially the standards for mathematical practice. With a mathematically proficient student is the way you start every single one of those.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, I really like what Matt said to the group when he talked about that a lot of teachers are starting to get a little nervous about how heavy the statistics content is in the Common Core state standards.
Yes.
And he's absolutely right that activities like this one, and there are many others like this where you're bringing in that visual approach to help build student understanding. I think it actually helps build the teacher understanding too in the heavy stats that's come down into Common Core.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was teaching a workshop this summer, and the participants asked about a stat which some of you may teach in Algebra 1 called mean absolute deviation. And almost everyone in the participants, they said that they didn't really know what it was. And the AP Stat teachers in the class said they didn't know what it was because it's not part of the AP Stat curriculum, but it's part of the Common Core, the mean absolute deviation. And it's really kind of, it's like part of standard deviation. Normally in the standard deviation formula, we have those differences between the mean and the values, and so we square them to make them positive. And essentially what mean absolute deviation does, instead of squaring them, it takes the absolute value of them. And that's basically the idea of it. It's kind of very similar to standard deviation, but it's called the mean absolute deviation, the MAD, if you ever heard of that. And it's interesting because I think, well, who's explaining that concept to teachers? I mean, the stat teachers don't even really know about it because it's not part of their curriculum. And the other teachers, it's just kind of been sprung on them with no real PD training for statistics, except for what they had back in college. So I think it's a real challenge that statistics has infected many of the subjects, and yet teachers aren't prepared. Well, Katie, what do you think? Any other comments we missed here?
I think we hit a lot of them. I'm seeing a lot of people talking about how important it is that students are taking ownership over their learning, that by Vince said, when I move this point, this is what happened, and by them actually moving it, they're taking ownership over what's happening in that mathematics and building their understanding.
Yeah. Well, I hope this has been a helpful webinar for you all. This is certainly interesting. I thought that I learned a lot from you, Katie. I feel like you expounded some of that Common Core knowledge. I can tell you're using that a lot in your classroom, and I appreciated you being part of this. I thought you did a